The year is 1945. The world is in ruins. In the shattered remnants of the Third Reich, a generation of women, once indoctrinated into the iron will of the Nazi war machine, now face an uncertain future. They were nurses, signal operators, anti-aircraft gunners, and even frontline auxiliaries, their lives defined by a conflict they didn't start, but which consumed them nonetheless. Captured by Allied forces, they found themselves in a strange land, America. They were prisoners of war, yet their reality was a stark departure from the brutal camps of their male counterparts. This is the untold story of thousands of German women who, when given the chance to return to a broken homeland, chose instead to stay in the very country they were once taught to despise. They were told, "You can go home," but they looked at the smoking rubble of Europe and begged to remain in America. Their plea wasn't one of cowardice, but of hope, a desperate cry for a new life. This is their story. Opening scene. A train whistle blows, a long, mournful sound cutting through the humid air of a late spring day in 1945. The scene is sepia-toned, reminiscent of old newsreels. The camera is positioned low, capturing the perspective of someone on the ground. We see the muddy boots of American GIs, then the legs of weary women in ill-fitting uniforms shuffling toward a waiting boxcar. Their faces are a mix of exhaustion, fear, and a guarded curiosity. The setting is a rail yard in northern France, a temporary holding pen for thousands of captured German soldiers. The war in Europe was over. But for the women of the Wehrmacht and its various support arms, the Nachrichtenhelferinnen, the Flakhelferinnen, the nurses of the Wehrmacht Sanitätsdienst, the conflict had merely changed form. They had been captured in the final chaotic weeks of the war, swept up in the Allied advance across Germany. Many were barely out of their teens, thrust into roles far beyond the romanticized image of a nation's daughters. They had served the Reich, but now the Reich was gone. Their reality was a stark, brutal shock. They had been taught that the enemy was a monstrous, faceless entity, yet here were the Americans, their captors, who handed out chocolate and cigarettes, who spoke a strange, guttural language, but offered a glimpse of a different kind of humanity. One such woman was Liesel Müller, a 22-year-old nurse from Munich. The camera finds her in the crowd, her face a pale oval, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and defiance. She clutches a small, worn photograph of her younger brother, who was reported missing on the Eastern Front. Liesel had served in a field hospital near the Rhine, witnessing the horrific carnage of the final campaigns. She had seen the war up close and personal, in the mangled bodies of young boys and old men, in the desperate eyes of soldiers clinging to life. She had believed in her duty, in serving the Heimat. But the sight of her country in ruins, the endless stream of refugees, and the chilling emptiness of defeat had shattered her illusions. The American guards were surprisingly gentle. They were not the brutes of Nazi propaganda. They were young, many of them just as bewildered by the scale of the war as the women themselves. They moved with a quiet efficiency, herding the women onto the trains bound for a port. The destination was a whispered rumor: America. Liesel had learned to be cynical, but the word America held a mythic quality. It was a land of movies and jazz, of limitless food and gleaming automobiles. It was the antithesis of the bombed-out wasteland she was leaving behind. A young American corporal named Tom, with a kind face and a smudge of grease on his cheek, offered Liesel a piece of bread. She flinched, her instincts telling her to refuse a kindness from the enemy. But hunger won out. She took it, their fingers brushing for a moment. He offered a small, hesitant smile. "Welcome to America," he said in heavily accented German. Liesel didn't know what to make of it. Could this place truly offer a future, or was this just another form of captivity? The train lurched forward, carrying them away from the ruins of their old lives. The journey was long and agonizing, a blur of strange landscapes and foreign voices. The women were packed tightly, the air thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and unwashed uniforms. They spoke in hushed tones, trading stories of their past lives and their desperate hopes for the future. Liesel listened, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. She had been taught that the American nation was weak, decadent, and racially impure. But the men she had met seemed normal. They had families. They laughed. They were kind in a way that felt both disarming and deeply unsettling. One of the other women, a flamboyant former radio operator named Helga, whispered to Liesel, "They're just softening us up, you'll see. They'll work us to death or worse." Liesel didn't know what to believe. She clutched the photograph of her brother, the only tangible link to a world that was gone forever. The train rattled on, a metallic symphony of uncertainty, carrying them into a future they couldn't possibly imagine. But as the train rumbled across the vast, endless ocean, a new feeling began to stir within Liesel. It was a faint flicker of possibility, a fragile ember of hope in the ashes of her old world. She didn't know it then, but this journey wasn't just a physical one. It was a journey from one identity to another, a journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself and the world. When the ship finally docked, its massive hull a dark shadow against the morning light, the women were greeted by a sight that took their breath away. This was not the broken world they had left behind. This was a land of promise. But what kind of promise awaited them? Opens on a bustling American port. The camera is high, looking down on the deck of a massive troop transport ship. The women, in their drab uniforms, are a striking contrast to the vibrant chaos of the docks below. American dock workers, their faces a mosaic of nationalities, move with a frantic energy. The air is filled with the cacophony of cranes, shouting, and the distant wail of a tugboat. Liesel steps off the gangplank, her face a mask of awe and disbelief. The American camps for female German POWs were a stark departure from their male counterparts. While the men were often sent to desolate, remote locations, the women were housed in facilities that, while still secure, were designed for a different purpose. Many were located on military bases that had once served as training centers or administrative hubs. The camps were clean, orderly, and to the women who had grown accustomed to the grim reality of a war-torn Europe, surprisingly comfortable. They were given clean cots, 3 meals a day, and access to basic hygiene facilities. For Liesel, the sight of a hot meal, not watery soup or stale bread, but real food, was a shock to the system. The American diet, rich in meat, fresh vegetables, and sugar, was a luxury beyond comprehension. The first time she was given a glass of milk, she drank it slowly, savoring every drop as if it were the most precious liquid in the world. But the real shock was the work. The women were not subjected to hard labor. Instead, they were put to work in roles that utilized their skills and offered them a sense of purpose. Liesel, along with her fellow nurses, was assigned to the base hospital. They were tasked with assisting American doctors and nurses, tending to wounded American soldiers returning from the Pacific. It was a bizarre twist of fate. They were nursing the very men they had been fighting against, the men who had defeated their nation. The initial interactions were tense. American nurses were hesitant, and the soldiers, many of whom bore the scars of a brutal war, were wary of their German counterparts. Liesel found herself caring for a young Marine who had lost his leg in Okinawa. He was angry and bitter, his pain an open wound. Liesel, in her heavily accented English, tried to offer comfort, but he turned his head away. "Go back to your damn Nazis," he spat. Liesel's heart sank. She knew the stigma would be impossible to shake, but she persisted. She cared for him with the same dedication she would have shown a German soldier, cleaning his wounds, changing his dressings, and offering quiet words of encouragement. Gradually, a fragile trust began to form. The Marine, whose name was David, started to talk to her, not about the war, but about his life before it, about his family in Kansas, about his dreams of opening a small diner. Liesel, in turn, found herself sharing stories about her own life, about the small joys of growing up in Munich, about her dreams of becoming a doctor before the war had intervened. The hospital became a microcosm of a new, tentative world. The uniforms were different, the allegories of war were reversed, but the shared experience of pain and healing transcended national loyalties. The women were not just workers. They were human beings, and the Americans, in turn, were not just captors. They were people with their own lives, their own stories, their own burdens. The camp itself was an odd blend of freedom and confinement. The women were allowed to move about within the fenced perimeter, attend classes, and even put on plays and concerts. They had access to a library stocked with American magazines and books. Liesel spent her evenings poring over magazines, looking at the vibrant advertisements for household appliances and fashionable clothing, a world so far removed from the scarcity and destruction of her homeland that it felt like a fantasy. One evening, a group of American GIs put on a makeshift dance for the camp, playing swing music on a gramophone. The women were hesitant at first, but the infectious rhythms soon won them over. Liesel found herself being twirled around by Corporal Tom, the same corporal from the train. He was clumsy but earnest, and as they danced, she felt a genuine, unguarded laugh escape her lips for the first time in years. The world she had known, the world of discipline and sacrifice and endless conflict, was slowly giving way to something new, something hopeful. But the shadow of their past loomed large. A German officer, a strict and unforgiving woman who had been a high-ranking member of the League of German Girls, watched from the sidelines, her face a mask of disapproval. She saw the women's assimilation not as a path to a new life, but as a betrayal of their heritage, a capitulation to the enemy. She reminded them of their duty, of the glory of the fatherland, and of the shame of their defeat. She was a ghost of their old lives, a stark reminder of the world they had left behind. Liesel felt a pang of guilt, a fleeting memory of the person she used to be, a girl who believed with fierce conviction in the righteousness of her cause. The dancing ended and the music died down. Liesel walked back to her barracks, the memory of her brother's face flashing in her mind. Had she forgotten him? Had she betrayed him? Her heart was a battleground, torn between the pull of a past that was dying and the promise of a future that was just beginning. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The women were learning a new language, a new culture, a new way of being. They were no longer just German POWs. They were something else, something undefinable. But their status was temporary. Their time as prisoners was drawing to a close. The war in the Pacific was over, and the world was beginning to pick up the pieces. The day came when they were all assembled in a large hall. An American general, a stern-looking man with kind eyes, stood at the podium. He announced that the repatriation process would begin soon. "You will be returned to your homes, to your families," he said. The words should have been a comfort, but they hung in the air like a death sentence. The women looked at each other, their faces a mixture of confusion and dread. They had been given a taste of a new life, and now they were being told to go back to the ruins. For Liesel, the prospect of returning to a country that was little more than a pile of rubble, a land where her brother was lost and her family's future was uncertain, was a source of profound anguish. The memory of the Marine she had nursed, the kindness of Corporal Tom, the vibrant colors of the American magazines, it was all a powerful contrast to the bleak image of her homeland. She looked around the room at the faces of the women who had become her new family. They were all thinking the same thing. They had come to America as prisoners, but they had found something more, something they couldn't bear to lose. And so a quiet, desperate plan began to form in the minds of these women. They would not go home. But how could they convince their captors to let them stay? Is a bare-walled room, a makeshift office at the camp's administrative building. A single bare light bulb casts long shadows. Liesel and two other women, one a former secretary and the other a cook, sit across a desk from a harried-looking American captain. The captain, whose name is Miller, looks exhausted, the weight of 1,000 administrative decisions on his face. He taps a pencil against a stack of papers. The petition to stay was born of desperation and a quiet, collective resolve. It started with whispers in the barracks, hushed conversations over dinner, and secret meetings after lights out. It was a radical idea, a plea for the impossible. They were prisoners, enemy nationals, and the rules of war dictated their repatriation. But they had nothing to return to. The war had taken their homes, their families, and their sense of a future. America, once the enemy, had become a safe haven, a sanctuary of abundance and possibility. The petition was a simple document, written in a halting, formal English that was a testament to their recent studies. It was a plea, not a demand. It spoke of their newfound skills, their desire to work, and their willingness to contribute to American society. It was signed by hundreds of women, their signatures a testament to their shared conviction. Liesel was the one chosen to present it. Her quiet strength and her experience in the hospital had earned her the respect of the other women. She stood before Captain Miller, the petition clutched in her hands, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Captain Miller read the document slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up, his eyes meeting Liesel's. "You understand this is highly irregular?" he said. "This is unprecedented. We are not a nation of captors. We are a nation of laws. The law says you must go home." Liesel took a deep breath. "Captain," she began, her voice steady despite her trembling hands, "we do not ask for charity. We ask for a chance. Our homes are gone. Our families are scattered. Germany is a graveyard. Here we have learned. We have worked. We have found a purpose. We are not the women who came here. We are different now." Her words were a simple, powerful truth. Miller was a soldier, but he was also a man with a heart. He had seen the devastation of Europe firsthand. He knew what they were talking about. He also knew the immense bureaucratic hurdles that lay ahead. He couldn't make this decision. It would require a directive from a higher authority, from the War Department itself. He told them he would forward the petition, but he warned them not to get their hopes up. The women left the office, their hopes hanging in the balance. The days that followed were filled with a tense, agonizing wait. The repatriation process was already underway. Some women, their hearts still tied to their families and a sense of duty, chose to return to Germany. They boarded the ships, their faces a mixture of sorrow and a fragile hope. Liesel watched them go, a lump in her throat. She understood their choice, but she couldn't share it. Her future was no longer in Germany. It was here, in this strange land. The petition, against all odds, made its way up the chain of command. It landed on the desk of a high-ranking general in the War Department, a man who, like Miller, had seen the wreckage of Germany. The general was initially skeptical. This was a diplomatic nightmare, a political hot potato. But he read the words of the women, their plea for a new life, and he was moved. The war was over. The world was changing. Perhaps it was time for the rules to change as well. He passed the petition to his superiors, and the debate began. The arguments against were many and varied. They were former enemies. Their loyalty was suspect. It set a dangerous precedent. But there were also powerful arguments in favor. They were not hardened soldiers. They were young women, many of them victims of a tyrannical regime as much as its servants. They were a potential workforce. And perhaps most importantly, it was a gesture of humanity, a powerful statement to the world that America was a nation of second chances. A decision was finally made. The women would not be forced to return to Germany, but they could not simply be released into the general population. They were still, in a sense, in legal limbo. A new program was created, a unique and unprecedented initiative. The women would be paroled to American families, who would sponsor them and provide them with work and a place to live. It was a test, a leap of faith. The news arrived at the camp like a bolt of lightning. The women gathered in the common hall, their faces a mix of disbelief and overwhelming relief. The American general who had approved the plan was there, and he spoke of a new beginning, of the promise of America. Liesel stood in the back of the crowd, tears streaming down her face. She had done it. They had done it. They had begged to stay, and the country they had been taught to hate had said yes. The next phase was the most difficult. They had to be placed with American families, and they were, in many ways, an unknown quantity. They had been given a new life, but it was a life that would come with its own challenges, its own prejudices, and its own unique set of obstacles. The path ahead was not an easy one. Liesel knew she would have to leave the security of the camp, the only home she had known for the past year. She would have to confront a world she only knew through magazines and movies. She was no longer a prisoner, but she was not yet a citizen. Her new life was a blank slate, and she was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. She had made a deal with her heart, and now it was time to see if she had made the right choice. Her new journey was about to begin, and she had no idea where it would take her. On a bustling train station in a small Midwestern town, the camera focuses on a woman, Liesel, standing on the platform. She is no longer in her uniform. She wears a simple, modest dress, a gift from the camp. Her suitcase, a battered old thing, sits at her feet. She looks lost, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the landscape and the foreignness of the people around her. The station is a whirlwind of activity. Families reuniting, soldiers returning home, the air thick with the promise of a post-war future. Liesl is an anomaly, a ghost of a war that is now over. Liesl's sponsors were the O'Malley family, an Irish-American couple with a small farm in rural Ohio. They had lost their only son in the war, and in a gesture of profound empathy, they had volunteered to take in a German woman. Liesl was picked up at the station by Mrs. O'Malley, a stout woman with a warm, wrinkled face and a laugh that seemed to fill the air. She spoke to Liesl in a slow, patient voice, her words a mix of kindness and a gentle, firm resolve. "Welcome to America, child," she said, her accent thick and unfamiliar. The O'Malley farm was a universe away from the bombed-out urban landscape of Munich. It was a place of green fields, the smell of fresh hay, and the distant lowing of cattle. The house was small but clean and filled with a warmth Liesl had not felt in years. But it was not a fairy tale. Liesl was not a guest. She was a worker. Her job was to help with the chores, tending the garden, helping with the canning, and assisting in the kitchen. The work was physically demanding, and the language barrier was a constant source of frustration. Liesl felt a profound sense of isolation. She was surrounded by kindness, but she was also a stranger in a strange land. She ate her meals in silence, struggling to understand the rapid-fire conversations of the O'Malleys and their extended family. The neighbors were curious, some more welcoming than others. Liesl was a curiosity, a symbol of the very war they had fought, but Liesl was not alone. The O'Malleys, in their quiet, unassuming way, began to break down the walls she had built around her heart. Mrs. O'Malley taught her to bake pies, a skill Liesl had never possessed. They spent hours together in the kitchen, the air filled with the scent of cinnamon and apples, their communication a mixture of gestures and a few shared words. Liesl began to see the small, everyday kindnesses that made up the fabric of American life. Mr. O'Malley, a quiet and gruff man, would leave a small cup of hot coffee for her every morning on the kitchen table. Their daughter, a boisterous teenager named Sarah, taught Liesl how to drive a tractor, laughing as Liesl stalled it repeatedly in the fields. Slowly, painfully, Liesl began to heal. The nightmares of the war, the endless stream of wounded soldiers, the constant fear. They did not disappear, but they began to recede, replaced by the rhythm of daily life on the farm. She learned to appreciate the simple pleasures, the taste of a fresh-baked biscuit, the warmth of the sun on her face, the sound of the crickets at night. She began to see the war not as a defining event, but as a terrible chapter in a much longer story. She was beginning to write a new chapter, one filled with the quiet grace of a life in progress. The other women were experiencing similar journeys. Some found work in factories, others as domestic servants. The challenges were immense. They faced prejudice, suspicion, and the constant burden of their past. But they also found unexpected friendships and a sense of belonging. The German-American community, many of them immigrants from a generation before, offered support and a connection to their heritage. They formed their own support networks, meeting in secret to speak German and share stories of their lives in America. For the first time in her life, Liesl was not defined by her nationality, but by her humanity. She was a woman, a worker, a friend. The world was bigger than the Third Reich, bigger than the war. But the past was not so easily forgotten. One day, while at the local grocery store, Liesl overheard a conversation. A group of men were talking about the war, about the Hun women, who were now living among them. They spoke of the atrocities, of the concentration camps, of the horrors of the Third Reich. The words cut through Liesl like a knife. She knew they were right. She knew the terrible things that had been done in the name of her country. She had not been a party to them, but she carried the weight of that legacy, a silent and profound burden. She had been given a new life, a second chance. But could she ever truly escape the shadow of the past? She realized her journey to stay in America was not just about survival. It was about redemption. She had to prove not just to the Americans, but to herself, that she was worthy of this new life, that she was more than the sum of her country's sins. She had been a prisoner of war, but the deeper, more profound prison had been the one she carried within her heart. And she was just beginning to realize that the key to that prison was forgiveness. But could she ever truly forgive herself? The next step in her journey would require a courage she didn't know she possessed. Is a small, crowded classroom in the back of a community hall. The room is filled with women of all ages, all of them German, all of them POWs on parole. The air is thick with the scent of chalk and the nervous energy of new beginnings. Liesel sits in the front row, a notebook and pencil in hand, her face a picture of intense concentration. The teacher is a kindly, middle-aged woman named Miss Johnson, who is patiently explaining the intricacies of American civics. The women were not just learning to be Americans. They were being prepared for a formal path to citizenship. The parole program was not a permanent solution. It was a bridge to a new life, and the ultimate goal for many of them was to become American citizens. Liesel, in particular, was driven by a powerful desire to make her new life official. She attended every class, devoured every book, and practiced her English with a ferocious intensity. She was not just learning a language. She was learning a culture, a history, a new way of seeing the world. The classes were a microcosm of their new lives. They learned about the Constitution, about the American system of government, about the rights and responsibilities of citizenship. They were taught that America was a nation founded on a belief in freedom and democracy, ideas that were a stark contrast to the totalitarian ideology they had been raised with. Liesel found herself fascinated by the stories of immigrants who had come to America from all over the world, seeking a better life. She saw herself in their struggles, their hopes, and their dreams. The classes were not just a means to an end. They were a process of transformation. The women were shedding their old identities and beginning to embrace a new one. But the path to citizenship was not without its hurdles. The process was long and arduous. They had to pass a series of interviews, prove their good character, and demonstrate their understanding of American civics. For Liesel, the most difficult part was the interview with the Immigration and Naturalization Service. The interviewer, a stern-faced man with a piercing gaze, asked her a series of probing questions about her past. "What was your role in the war?" he asked. "Did you support the Nazi Party?" "What do you think of America now?" Liesel answered honestly, her voice steady. She spoke of her service as a nurse, of her disillusionment with the regime, and of her profound gratitude for the second chance she had been given. She didn't try to romanticize her past or pretend to be someone she wasn't. She was a product of her time and her country, but she was also a woman who had seen the folly of that path and was determined to forge a new one. The interviewer listened, his expression unreadable. He asked her a final question. "Why do you want to be an American citizen, Liesel?" She looked him in the eye and said, "Because this is the only home I have left. This is where I found hope." The man nodded, closed his notebook, and wished her luck. Liesel left the office, her heart in her throat. She had laid her soul bare, and now she had to wait. While the women were on their path to citizenship, another, more profound transformation was taking place. The Americans who had sponsored them, who had welcomed them into their homes, were also undergoing a change. They were learning about the human cost of war, not from a newspaper or a newsreel, but from the person living in their spare bedroom. The O'Malleys in particular were profoundly impacted by Liesel's presence. They had seen her quiet resilience, her hard work, and her deep-seated desire for a new life. They had come to see her not as an enemy, but as a daughter. One evening, Mrs. O'Malley sat Liesel down and gave her a small, worn photograph. It was a picture of her son, the soldier who had died in the war. Liesel looked at the smiling face, so young and full of life, and she felt a wave of profound sorrow. Mrs. O'Malley told her that she had lost a son, but she had gained a daughter. The words were a balm to Liesel's soul, a powerful affirmation that she was not just an employee or a project, but a part of their family. Liesel looked at the photo, and for the first time, she truly understood the immense grace that had been shown to her. She had been given a second chance, but so had the O'Malleys. They had found a way to heal their own grief by opening their hearts to a former enemy. But the process was not always so smooth. Some of the women were not so lucky. They found themselves with sponsors who were cruel, exploitative, or simply unable to overcome their own prejudices. They faced suspicion and hostility in their communities. Some were forced to flee their situations, finding refuge in the German-American communities that had sprung up around the country. Liesel knew she was one of the lucky ones, but she also knew that their collective success depended on their ability to prove to the American people that they were worthy of this chance. The final hurdle was the naturalization ceremony. For Liesel, it was a day of profound significance. It was a crisp, clear autumn day. The ceremony was held in a large courtroom. Liesel stood with dozens of other immigrants from all over the world, their faces a mix of pride and relief. An American judge, a woman with a powerful and resonant voice, administered the oath of citizenship. "I hereby declare on oath," the judge began, "that I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty, of whom or which I have heretofore been a subject or citizen." Liesel, her hand raised, repeated the words, her voice a little shaky but full of conviction. She was no longer a subject of the German state. She was a citizen of the United States. She had made a promise, and she had kept it. But this was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of her new life, a life in a country that had once been her enemy, but was now her home. As she left the courtroom, a new question began to form in her mind. What would she do with this new life? What would she become? A modern, bustling American city street in the 1960s. The camera moves through a crowd of people, a riot of color and motion. We see signs for a diner, a movie theater, a bookstore. A woman walks with purpose through the crowd, her hair in a neat bun, her dress stylish but simple. Her face is a little older, her eyes filled with a quiet confidence. It is Liesel. She is a long way from the scared young woman on the train. Liesel had used her nursing skills and her relentless work ethic to build a life for herself. She had gone to college on a scholarship, her transcripts from Germany a testament to her intelligence and her aptitude for medicine. She had graduated with honors and had gone on to work in a local hospital. She was no longer an auxiliary. She was a registered nurse, a respected member of her community. She had found a purpose, a profession that allowed her to do good, to heal, and to give back to the country that had given her so much. She had a small apartment, a circle of friends, and a life that was entirely her own. She had built a new life from the ground up, a testament to her resilience and the quiet promise of her adopted country. She had even reconnected with a man she had met in the hospital, an American doctor who had been impressed by her skill and her dedication. They had fallen in love and were now a family, a testament to the power of a new beginning. But Liesel never forgot where she came from. She kept in touch with the other women who had stayed, their stories a shared tapestry of struggle and success. They were scattered across the country, a diaspora of women who had chosen a new life. They were a testament to the power of forgiveness, of hope, and of the human spirit. They had a reunion every few years, a gathering of women who had once been enemies and were now friends, mothers, and grandmothers. They spoke a mix of German and English, their stories a living history of a unique and forgotten chapter of the war. They had been told they could go home, but they had chosen to stay in a country that had once been their enemy. And in doing so, they had found not just a new life, but a new identity. The documentary's final scene is a powerful one. Liesel, now an elderly woman, sits on a porch swing, a blanket over her knees. She is talking to her granddaughter, a bright young woman with a curious and questioning mind. The granddaughter asks her about the war, about her life in Germany, about why she chose to stay in America. Liesel looks out at the setting sun, a peaceful smile on her face. "I had a choice," she says, her voice a little raspy but full of a quiet wisdom. "I could have gone back to the rubble, to the memories, to the life that was over. Or I could have stayed and built something new. I chose to build." Her story, and the stories of thousands of other women like her, is a testament to the American ideal of second chances. It is a story of a defeated people who found victory not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, unassuming act of building a new life. They had been prisoners of war, but they had found freedom not in a legal document, but in the simple act of choosing a new home. But their legacy is not just one of personal success. It is also a question that hangs in the air, a question for a new generation. Can a country built on war, on conflict, on the endless cycle of violence and retribution, ever truly become a land of peace and new beginnings? Liesel's life was a powerful answer, but the future was an unwritten book. And as she looked out at the peaceful twilight, she knew that the real work was not in the past, but in the days to come. The sun dipped below the horizon, a final burst of color, and the screen faded to black.